So we're continuing on our discussion from last week about compositing, rendering and compositing, and techniques that allow us to work with various parts of our rendered images. So in this, as I said, this scene is basically from last week, except I've added in some clamps as well as a probe to have a little bit more in the scene to work with anyways. So there are a number of reasons why we'd want to isolate part of an image or define a region or define some kind of data relevant to this scene so that we could do various compositing things. One reason might be we would want to apply an effect to a probe and nothing else, or apply an effect in After Effects to just this tissue stuff. We might want to mask out part of a layer, like we might want to mask out just this part of the probe that's sticking out here, or maybe one of these, one half of the clamps versus the other. So there's lots of different reasons why we would want to be able to select a region in After Effects to work with differently. Even further, we might want to fade out or blur something that is not with respect to individual objects, but with respect to the depth that the objects are in relative to the camera. So something called a depth pass, which we can work with. So if we let's go over to After Effects just to start, and I've got this compositing start open, which just gives us a little bit of media to work with. The tissue small and the probe small, I'm going to drag into a new composition and just leave the default here. So basically all I want to do, these are very low res images, but they still serve the purpose. This is from, I think, last week, or yeah. Make sure that the tissue is on the bottom and the probe is on the top. So there are three main strategies for defining regions. We can use a mask, we can use the alpha, and we can use the luminance of an image. So the first thing that we can work with is masks. And the way that we define a mask is with either the shape, the rectangle tool, or one of these other shape tools, or with the pen tool. And the pen tool is more flexible. So let's say we just want to show this part of the image. Well, with the relevant layer selected, we've got this probe selected. With the pen tool, we can just click and drag and just create a quick mask around there. And if we come back to the beginning, then we get a closed loop. This works exactly the same as like the pen tool in Illustrator does, or in Photoshop. And you can see as soon as we close that loop, we've basically isolated that part of this layer. Okay? So if we have a layer, then the mask tool, it functions as a mask tool. If we don't have anything selected and we're using the pen tool, then what happens is we create what's called a shape layer. And so the pen tool acts the same way, but it produces a shape defined by the fill and stroke properties here. So this little toggle here, the tool creates shape versus tool creates mask, that automatically switches when you have a layer selected. So it's automatically creating a mask when you've got a layer selected. So that's an important thing to know. Okay, so let's get rid of the shape layer because we're talking about masks specifically. We can get to the mask attributes if we toggle open this triangle here and open up the masks here. We can see, okay, we've got mask 1. That's this one here, and we could move it around, or sometimes it's hard to figure out how to select the individual knots or the individual anchor points here. But if we go back to the selection tool, then we get this little white arrow that allows us to marquee select over some of the anchor points if the mask is selected and we've got the selection tool. Okay, so we could edit the mask after the fact. And if we dial that open even further, then we've got even more options. We could, for example, feather this out, which in this case is just really kind of going to blur that area. But if we had this a little bit of a bigger mask, we could see how that feathering would work here at this boundary. And the two main operations for this mask that are beneficial to work with are in add mode or subtract mode. And this is different than what we're familiar with the blending layers or the blending modes. This is different, but add is basically taking the region within the mask, and subtract is hiding the region within the mask. So adding and subtracting with masks. The other way that we can use masks, besides just hiding and showing stuff in a layer, is we can use that to define the region over which an effect takes place. And one way that we can use a mask in that way is with adjustment layers. So I'm just going to delete this mask I selected the mask here and then hit delete. And we want to, instead of applying a mask to our image layers, we want to apply it to an adjustment layer. So an adjustment layer is basically a blank canvas that allows you to put effects on it. And the reason why it's different from applying an effect to a layer itself is an adjustment layer applies the effect to everything below it in the stack here. So instead of, let's just try the exposure node. Instead of putting the exposure node on the probe and dialing that down, you can see that's only being applied to this layer. Instead, let's hit Command X to cut that effect and create a new adjustment layer. And so the adjustment layer comes in, and then we paste that effect back onto it, or we could just drag the exposure onto from the effects panel here. Or of course we could access all of our effects in the effect menu here. Color correction, exposure, that sort of thing. But now when we dial this in, you can see that this adjustment layer is affecting everything below it in the stack. And I think that if we dropped it down in between, then you can see that that's true, that it's not applying to the probe above it. Okay, so adjustment layers are useful, but they can also have masks applied to them. So for example, let's take the ellipse tool, and we'll start in the middle here, making sure that the adjustment layer is selected. And if we drag this out and hold down Command, we hold down Command, we can kind of bring this out and make an oval here. And then under the mask, we can change this to subtract, and we can also feather it. And voila, we've got a little bit of a vignette happening here. So that's basically combining adjustment layers with this exposure effect and the mask, and we've got a pretty simple vignette over it. So that's how adjustment layers work, and that's how masks work. Now, there are, as I said, there are three sort of main approaches for selecting regions. The first being masks, which we've talked about. But we also have the ability to work with luminance information in an image. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the same way that we've used the mask to define the region over which an effect takes place, we can use grayscale information to determine how much of an effect is applied. So let's, for example, I'm going to take a new solid, and it doesn't really matter what color it is, but I'm just going to make sure that it's the comp size. So we've got a small composition here, and that's going to come in over top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for a ramp in the effect. And really the only reason that I'm doing this is so that I can generate some kind of grayscale information on this image. We'll see how we can, instead of generating these grayscale images in After Effects, we'll see how we can generate them in Maya to create more useful effects. But for now, so we've got this black to white gradient, and I'm going to open up my adjustment layer and delete the mask. We've got a grayscale image right above the adjustment layer, and this relationship, this sequence is important. We've got our adjustment layer and the grayscale image on top of it. And we have this column called track matte. And track mats are very useful for this kind of region selection. So if you don't see it, you might need to toggle the switches and modes here at the bottom, which will change between these icons that are for 3D layers and motion blur and those sorts of things. So we've got toggle switches and modes, and now we should be seeing the blending mode as well as the track mats. Okay, so looking at this track mat here, the track mats are taken from the layer that's immediately above them in the stack, which is the reason why the top layer here doesn't have that option, because there's nothing above it. So the adjustment layer we've got a couple of options here. We've got a few options. We can either take alpha information or we can take luma information. And luma information is grayscale information, where white is 100% and black is 0%. So if we took luma mat, After Effects automatically hides the grayscale image here. You can see that the icon has disappeared here. We could turn it back on to show it, but it automatically gets hide. And we've got this luma mat so that this adjustment layer is applied based on this ramp. It's a little hard to see the effect if I increase that here. You can see that where the ramp was dark, that effect, that exposure compensation had little effect, and where the effect was white, or where the ramp was white, that effect has maximum effect. If we wanted to flip that around, we could do luma inverted, and that means that black is 100% and white is 0%. So black and white grayscale images can be a great way to modulate the effect of an adjustment layer with various effects on it. The other option here, alpha matte, we've talked about alphas before. So for example, if let's just delete this white, this ramp solid, and drag this adjustment layer underneath let's just change this back to no track matte for a sec. In fact, we could hide it just for the moment. This probe small, if we solo this and look at its alpha channel with this little tricolor drop down here, alpha, you can see that this has a region with alpha has a black and a region with the alpha with white. Therefore, if we switch this back to RGB, if we choose the track matte for the adjustment layer to be based on the alpha, then that exposure is going to be applied to just that region. Now this is gone a little bit strange because what we've done is hidden the probe and use that as the region, the alpha region, to change the effect. So what's probably going to be a better workflow here is if we just duplicate this probe layer, drag it underneath the adjustment layer and turn it back on. I'll hide the adjustment layer for a sec. So this was our original setup, but now we've duplicated this probe layer and we're just using it as that alpha channel for the adjustment layer. So now if we, whoops, I accidentally opened up this layer viewer here. We can close that and come back to our composition. Now what we've done is we're defining the region based on the alpha of this layer for this effect. And so we're just using that area. Now, obviously, in this simple example, this would be exactly the same as if we just, instead of having an adjustment layer, we just applied the effect directly to that layer itself. But the principle is still there. It's still useful. We can use alpha regions to define where this information, where these corrections are going to be made. Okay, so let's go back into Maya and see how we can generate some different passes and layers that are going to make this actually a very useful workflow. So in Maya, let's say that we didn't render out a foreground and a background layer, or we weren't rendering out essentially different layers. We just rendered this all as our beauty pass. What we could do is we could create a new image that's going to allow us to make selections based on the objects in the scene. So what I want to do is I want to select all of these objects, and I'm going to make a new render layer. And I make a new render layer the same way as I make a new display layer. basically this icon, create a new layer and assign the selected objects. So now when I come there, there's no lights on this layer, there's nothing else, and I'm going to call this my ID layer. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a flat shaded color to each of these objects to define that region, and we're going to use surface shaders to do that. So let's open up the hypershade. So I'm going to make a surface shader, and okay, I've already made them, but because this was the file that I was working on, but we'll make them again. So I'll make one surface shader, and I'll call it red surface shader, and I'm going to set the color to 100% red. Now, it's important for the compositing process that this is 100% red. You can't just pick an arbitrary color. You can, but it makes the compositing process in After Effects much less clean. So my recommendation is to only work with red, green, and blue pure channels, because what that means is if we switch our color picker to the RGB view, we've got 1 in the red and 0 and 0 in the green and blue. And so if we create another surface shader, let's create another surface shader. We're going to create 3 of them, and you guessed it, this one's going to be green, and we're going to make it green. So this is 0 in red, 1 in green, and 0 in blue. Basically, this isn't about the colors, obviously. This is about specifying a value that After Effects can work with in order to pick out these regions. And the last one is going to be the blue surface shader. Okay. And in our ID layer, we're going to be applying each of these surface shaders to different objects. So let's pick this clamps here, and right click and assign that to the clamps. Select the probe, assign the green surface shader, and then we're going to select the tissue and assign our blue surface shader. Where's our blue surface shader? It is. All right, so now if we render this image, all we're getting is just pure red, green, and blue information. Okay? And that's going to be a useful image for After Effects. So I've already saved this out in the composition, so we could save this out or batch render it or whatever we were doing in our process as a separate layer. But I've saved this out as this villi object layer.tiff. So if we take a look at this, we can see that we've got the red, pure green, pure blue, and pure green defined regions. So let's come back to our composition. Now we've got, this was the old image, so let's actually take this villi render main 720p, and I'm going to make a new composition, just dragging onto the new composition. All right. And in this render, I just have this single layer, right? I haven't defined, I haven't put the forceps or the probe on different layers. So if I wanted to apply an effect just to one of these objects, I wouldn't be able to do that unless I have a pass like this, which is going to let me define those regions. Okay, so this red, green, and blue information creates a good way to select select those regions. And the effect that we need to use to do that is called shift channels. So if I search for shift channels, we can get that. It's also under effect. Let's see if I can remember effect, channel, shift channels. And this is pretty simple to use. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to take the alpha channel from a different channel. So remember when we're rendering these things out, these have 4 channels: red, green, blue, and alpha. The alpha channel for this image is just pure white. It's purely filled. It's completely filled. But we have the red, green, and blue information here. So we could take the alpha from the red channel. And what that's doing, if I unsolo this layer, is it's taking this image and it's cutting out the alpha, the transparency information, from where the red pixels were. Okay, so now we've got a way that we can select this region. If we created a new adjustment layer, put it underneath this object ID pass, and let's do like a hue and saturation, apply it to the adjustment layer, and we could make things green or something like that. We don't want to do that for the whole scene though. We want to use the alpha matte from this layer above it, right? So we're taking the alpha from this pass, which took the alpha from the red channel. And so it's a little hard to see here because this is kind of a mostly grayscale, but if we change the saturation and change the lightness, you can see what's going on here. Basically, we're just applying this effect to the region where the clamps were. And we could duplicate this whole thing, this complex again, and on this second version of the object layer, instead of taking the alpha from the red channel, we could take the alpha from the green channel. And so now we've got an adjustment layer that's going to allow us to work just on this probe object. And we could turn the brightness down and do something like that. And one final time, if we duplicate this layer, I'm just using Command D to duplicate. This object ID pass we could take from the blue channel. And now this adjustment layer is just working on the tissue, which had that blue channel. So this object ID pass or object layer allows us to select the regions in After Effects by using an alpha matte that is taken from this object layer. So you might be wondering, well, what if I have more than 3 objects in my scene? Or what if I want to separate out more than 3 objects? Can I use like yellow and pink and other colors? My recommendation is not to do that because this shift channel only really works with the red, green, and blue channels. So you want those as pure channels. There are other ways to do it, like you can do a color key, but I wonder if I can just show you. I'm just going to delete all of this. I can show you why color key doesn't work as well. So let's do a color key. I'll show this. And you can see that by default, the key color comes in as blue. We can change, let's say just key the red information. Nothing happens until we turn up the tolerance. But you can see that this is really got severe aliasing here, and it's not a clean matte, and so you'd have to kind of play with the feather and the tolerance and do messy stuff like that. So that's why I don't recommend doing colors other than red, green, and blue, because that way you can use the shift channels effect and really just pull those channels directly out. So again, what if you had more than 3? Well, you could make two different layers. So you could make, let's say you wanted, we could select all of these things and make another layer. And then you want this one to be red, this one to be green, this one to be blue, and then all of the rest of them could be just black, right? Something like that. And then you could render out one layer like that, and then you could render out a second layer while this one is green, another object is green, another object is red, and kind of build it up that way so you could have different selections. So that's the sort of manual way to get this object ID layer out. The new render pass system has something that's a little bit simpler, but in my opinion, it's not as, it doesn't always work quite as well, and we'll see what happens here. So when we talked about render passes before, we saw how we could render out like the direct diffuse and the reflection and the scatter information and generate those passes. We can also generate mila matte passes. And what that's going to do is it's going to create for each mila material, it's going to create a pass that defines that region. So if we check use matte passes, that's all we need to do. And then when we render it out, we're going to get another pass that has the information for each Mila material. I've tried playing with creating the material sets, and it hasn't worked, and I can't find any documentation on it. So if somebody knows how to use those properly, I'd be curious to know. But otherwise, just leave those alone and just check this checkbox. Okay, so what does that do? Well, let's open up this 720p render in IMF display and take a look at the layers. Okay, so this is our beauty pass, and I'll change the gamma up to 2.2 so that we can set up is in the gamma corrected space, so it looks right. And okay, so we're looking at the main channel or the main layer, which is basically the beauty pass. We also have, like, we rendered out ambient occlusion, which we talked about before. We've rendered out these individual components that we talked about last time as well, getting those. But we also have these two down here. So there's a matte tissue Mila material, and you can see that that's generated white information where that Mila material was applied on the tissue. And then we have another one called the metal Mila material, and that's white where the metal Mila material has been applied. So now if we had maybe 10 or 20, there would be 10 or 20 different layers, each with that white information only where that Mila material was, and the rest of it black. So as you can guess, this only works with Mila materials. And so if you wanted to use this kind of object ID pass system, or material ID pass system more correctly, you would have to make sure that everything was using Mila materials. Okay, so how that works then in After Effects is exactly the same way that that we did last week, where we're using this extractor effect. If I make a duplicate here, where we choose red, green, and blue from the extractor, and now we've got that channel out of the pass. And so again, if we did an adjustment layer, put it underneath this pass, and would we choose alpha matte to select that region or luma matte? So what does the alpha of this one look like? I mean, you haven't seen it, so you can't really be sure of knowing. But the alpha here, it doesn't really have an alpha channel. It's just completely white. So instead, we would want to choose the luma matte, because that means that where that image was white, that effect is being applied, and where the image was black, that effect is not being applied. So with the pass system, we can generate passes that will allow us to create a luma matte for the material IDs. And with the render layer system, we can create an object ID pass that will allow us to define objects. Now you'll notice that because the clamps and the probe had the same material applied to them, we can't separate those out just using that system, unless we, for example, got our mask tool and just kind of went through here and just applied a mask around it. And now we've kind of combined that material ID pass with a mask, and now we've just restricted that. But of course, if this was animated, then you would have to animate the mask, and that would be a pain. So in that sense, it would be more efficient to use the object layer system. The problem, I do have a problem with After Effects, and I have not found a solution, and I'll just show you what's going on here. So if I make 3 copies here and of this image and look for shift channels, and I'm going to take the red, take the alpha from the red and copy that, and take the alpha from the green and copy that and take the alpha from the blue and go into the alpha channel, you can see there's a little bit of a fringe. So what should happen when I did that, basically I just separated this into the red, green, and blue components. It should completely add back up to a perfectly white image. But unfortunately, there's this little bit of fringe where the channel, where the colors weren't perfectly red or perfectly green, and that has to do with the anti-aliasing on the image. You can apply a choker, a matte choker, which basically what that'll do is it's going to adjust the, it's going to adjust the alpha. And so you can tweak that and get rid of most of it, but there are other regions where it's just not quite perfect. Yeah, it's just slight imperfections, which for the most part, if you're not making huge adjustments, like if you're not going totally nuts with these adjustment layers, should not be too noticeable. Let's talk about depth passes. Okay. So if we come back to our IMF display, the layered OpenEXR, we chose, in Maya, we chose this depth utility. And what this does is it renders out an image where the value of the image is based on the distance from the camera to the object. So let's see what that looks like in IMF display. Oh, and we could also check ambient occlusion to get ambient occlusion. I think we talked about that last time. So the depth pass, what does that look like? So under layer, I'm going to choose depth, and it has an asterisk. I'm not sure why it has an asterisk. I think either that's because there's only one channel, which is the Z channel instead of RGB, or it's because it's 32-bit instead of 16-bit, but either way. All right, so our depth channel looks pretty uninspiring. You might even think, okay, it didn't work properly. Something's gone wrong. It has not gone wrong. This is actually fine, because if you mouse over the image, there's this little numerical readout here at the bottom, and you'll see it's got a value of S, and there's like 42 or 50 or something like that. Basically what this image is holding is the actual distance in your Maya units from the camera to the object. So we're looking at ranges of 36, 38, 55, 60, 29, something like that. So your computer monitor can't show you a pixel value of 40. That's just, maximum is 1. That's why monitors, that's why this image needs to be output as a 32-bit image, is because otherwise it can't handle those sorts of values. So in After Effects, if we come back to this, let's just get rid of the adjustment layer, and instead of pulling out the matte, the metal matte, let's pull out the depth. So depth, and we'll just choose the same one for each RGB, depth, depth, depth. All right, and let's get rid of mask. All right, so we've got this white image, which is our depth pass, which we've pulled out of our OpenEXR, our layered EXR file. And if we take a peek in these RGB values, we can see that, yeah, we've got these huge, huge values that are much greater than 1. In contrast, if we've got a regular image, you can see that the RGB values should range from 0 to 1. Although in this case, because again, we've got a high dynamic image with these really bright highlights, we actually have higher values than 1, which is actually, incredibly valuable because that information is there and we could pull down the highlights without clipping the image, but that's kind of another discussion. Okay, so back to the depth pass. So in order to use this with After Effects utilities, we want to remap these values so that instead of going from 50 to 20 whatever, we want them to go from a range from 0 to 1. So we can use the levels effect to do that. And again, that's under color correction levels. So we'll pull in the levels effect. And what we want to change is the input black and input white values. Different 3D tools do this differently. Right now, what we've got is values from 20. Let's see if we can figure out what the lowest value is. I think it should be about 27, 26, something like that, through to about 60. So we could remap the farthest value to be black. So we could put something like 60 in for black. Okay, now we can actually see there's some data there. And then the white value we could put in the lowest value, like 25, something like that. So our closest object here is now remapped to a value of 1, and our farthest is remapped to a value of 0. Now that we've got that, we can actually use the luminance information in here, remember, as a luma mat for our blurring effect, essentially, our camera lens blur. So there is one important step before we apply that blur, and that is to pre-compose this depth layer. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull all of these attributes, these changes, into its own composition, so that will ensure that the effect is reading those values properly. If we don't do that, the effect is going to ignore these transformations that we've made, and it's not going to read properly. So in order to pre-compose that, we're going to right-click on that layer and choose Pre-Compose. And we could give it a name. We could call it Villi Depth. And we also want to make sure that we're moving all of the attributes into the new composition. So we're creating a nested composition. And this is one of the more powerful aspects of After Effects, is you can have these compositions within compositions that will allow you to build up your master scene or whatever you're doing. So we're going to move all of the attributes into the new composition. And now we've got this layer has been replaced by a composition. And if we double click on that, then we can jump back into that layer and we could apply changes to this. But for now, what we're wanting to do is we're going to want to apply a camera lens blur. So if we search for camera lens blur, we should be able to find that here in the effects panel. Otherwise, it should be under blur and sharpen, camera lens blur. Okay. So with the camera lens blur, basically the main thing that we want to choose is this layer. We want to choose layer Villi depth. And when we do that, we don't see any change because this Villi depth is still visible. So if we click the eye icon, then we're going to turn that off, or just hide it for the purposes. And now you can see that we've got some blurring going on here. So some of these objects are a little more blurry, some are less blurry. And we're simulating some depth of field. So we've got the blur radius, which is the amount of blur applied. So if we increase this, if we do this way up, then we're going to have extreme blur. And you can see that the area that's in focus is kind of in the background here. So the focal distance is what we want to choose, how deep that distance is. And what value do we want to choose? Well, we want to go back to our Villi depth and figure out what we want to be in focus. Maybe we want these crosshairs or this hinge on the clamps here. So then we want to take a look at the RGB values to figure out what that is. So that's about 0.7, right? So let's choose 0.7 and plug that into our focal distance. And now we can see that this joint is in focus and stuff around it has been blurred out. And we could go further and change like the bokeh shape, which is the shape of the aperture of the lens. Hexagon is fine. We could make it slightly rounder or something. Play around with stuff like that. We could change the threshold for the highlights for these bokeh stuff, and various other things like that. So that's how you can simulate depth of field, by rendering out a depth pass. My complaint is that this camera lens blur workflow is not very high quality. You can see here between the edge of the depth, or between the edge of two objects that are at different depth from each other, we get this sort of, you can get like this haloing effect going on, and we've got jaggies going on, and it's not too great. So if you've got a little bit of blur, maybe like 2.5 or something like that, even more, we could maybe 4 or 5, you can kind of get away with it. You can just kind of soften the background a little bit, and it looks pretty good. But my favorite plugin for After Effects is something called Frischluft. And Frischluft, it's hard to spell. Frischluft Lens Care. And this is an After Effects plugin that it's a little bit pricey. It's $200, but in my opinion, it's worth it. Like, it creates really nice depth of field, and there's virtually no artifacts. And so I found this really useful to create. This is all simulated depth of field. It's not rendered out in Maya. You can render out depth of field in Maya, but it takes a very long time. And so I found that rendering out a depth pass and then using the Frischluft plugin in After Effects was my preferred workflow. But this camera lens blur is the alternate method of doing pretty much the same thing. So just to summarize very briefly what we've talked about in After Effects here, 3 main regions, or 3 main ways of selecting regions. We've got the masks that we can draw with the pen tool. We've got using the alpha channel of things like the object ID pass to select a region, or using grayscale image, whether that's using the material ID pass that the Mila pass system has, or using grayscale depth maps to generate depth of field. You can also, there's also grayscale things like you could make a fractal. Here, let's make a new solid. You could apply a fractal noise to something and use that as a grayscale value to apply something over a region. So you can kind of stack up these effects and get some really interesting results that way.